A criminal investigation has been launched in Texas into how unsuspecting migrants were flown to Martha's Vineyard last week. Meanwhile, officials in Delaware were preparing for another plane on Tuesday. Manuel Bajorquez is in El Paso, Texas, with more.
Officials in Delaware scrambled to prepare for a possible flight with asylum seekers headed to an airport near President Biden's beach house that so far hasn't arrived.
We want to make sure that we provide that humanitarian support to them. These are folks who have been probably on a very long journey, and this would be another leg to that long journey.
It's the same plane that carried 48 migrants to Martha's Vineyard last week, prompting a criminal investigation by a Texas sheriff. Today, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis would not confirm whether he organized this latest flight and instead criticized the president.
If you believe in open borders, then it's the sanctuary jurisdictions that should have to bear the brunt of the open borders.
Migrant encounters hit a record, more than 2 million this year, driven largely by those coming from Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, crises-ridden countries where President Biden said returning them is, quote, not rational.
We're working with Mexico and other countries to see if we can stop the flow.
In El Paso, this migrant shelter taking in 400 people a day is not enough. Some are at motels, like these women from Venezuela.
Denver, Chicago.
They're trying to reach relatives in those cities and awaiting a bus ride there.
So you wouldn't have the money otherwise. No tuvieras el dinero de otra manera.
The city of El Paso is providing bus rides to ease the crowding here. We spoke with the mayor.
Are you concerned that the numbers will continue to rise at this point? Do you see them slowing down at any time?
No, it's very concerning. You know, yesterday we had 1,833. On Friday we had nearly almost 2,000. So, you know, when you're talking about a couple months ago we had 2,300 to 2,000, absolutely.
And tonight we're learning a federal civil rights lawsuit has been filed on behalf of the migrants who were flown to Martha's Vineyard and against Florida's governor and other officials, alleging the migrants were lured onto planes under false pretenses. John?
Manuel Bajorquez in El Paso, Texas. Thank you. For more on this, I'm joined by CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, as well as CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Welcome to both of you. Good to see you. Camilo, I want to start with you. What is the latest on this plane that was supposed to be headed towards Delaware? What's going on?
Yeah, well, John, there were reports today that Delaware officials could expect the arrival of a plane full of migrants from Florida to land in the state, but that has not materialized yet. We know that officials in Delaware, as well as refugee resettlement groups, were prepared to receive these migrants if they, in fact, had arrived. But we now know that that flight that had been tracking by officials has landed in New Jersey. But again, I think if this flight does indeed land in Delaware, at some point, it just goes to show the political nature of the actions by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, because you can certainly argue that the busing of migrants to New York City, Washington, D.C., and Chicago by Arizona and Texas are meant to send a political message of repudiation to the administration. But many migrants do, in fact, want to go to these large metro areas. Martha's Vineyard and Delaware are not popular destinations for migrants, but they are, however, places where Republicans believe there are liberal elites and that they believe they should be accommodating these migrants as well.
Ed, the intent here seems to be twofold. One is policy, get the White House to change their immigration policies. Obviously, politics also trying to draw President Biden into a response. He was asked about this plane flight, and he said about Governor Ron DeSantis, President Biden said he should come and visit, meaning Delaware, and that they have beautiful shoreline in Delaware. How do you read that address? And what is the administration actually doing, though, to address these flights of migrants?
Well, these specific flights that have been chartered by Republican governors or the donors who love them, there hasn't been much of a response because, you know, they're really, what would you do? You charge it with kidnapping, as some have suggested, or human trafficking. I mean, those are being investigated now by at least local law enforcement, but there's been no sign that the Justice Department, at least for now, is considering something. If anything, what it is the White House says, well, if Republicans are really serious about this, let's get together and write some legislation. And then they point to the fact that on his first day in office, they introduced a big comprehensive immigration bill. Problem is they haven't done anything about it since. And so in essence, it was released that day to appease a certain segment of the electorate, predominantly Latino voters, progressives who have been concerned about this, the business community to some extent that's worried about immigration. But you haven't seen much movement on that issue at all since. You had Inflation Reduction Acts, you had infrastructure bills that had to be addressed, the war in Ukraine. It's taken a lot of time, fine. But, as you know, better than anybody in this building, presidential attention and presidential muscle can be put behind something, and this president has been allergic to the issue.
And that answer about come to the shoreline was obviously not putting... That's right. Camilo, let me ask you, in keeping exactly with what Ed was talking about, President Biden addressed the idea of why these numbers that you and I talked about last night, the record number of apprehensions, the record activity on the border, why it was different for him than the previous administration. Let's listen to what President Biden said.
There are fewer immigrants coming from Central America and from Mexico. This is a totally different circumstance. What's on my watch now is Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And the ability to send them back to those states is not rational.
You explained this for us last night, Camilo, but explain what the president's trying to say.
Sure. Well, as Ed knows, the president rarely talks about border issues and immigration issues. This is an issue that the administration has tried to avoid because of the political optics. But in this instance, he's completely right. The migration challenges that both Presidents Obama and Trump faced during their respective tenures were completely different from what the Biden administration is currently facing right now at the U.S. Mexico border. Presidents Obama and Trump both had to face sharp increases in the number of Central American migrants, including vulnerable populations such as unaccompanied minors and families with children coming to the U.S. Mexico border. But under the Biden administration, record numbers of Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, Brazilians, Haitians, Colombians, and other nationalities are coming here to the U.S. Mexico border. And unlike the countries of Mexico and Central America, where the U.S. regularly deports people, it's hard for the administration to deport some of these other nationalities because of logistical and diplomatic reasons. For example, the authoritarian governments in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua don't accept U.S. deportations. And so the administration is facing an unprecedented refugee crisis here in the hemisphere, as well as continuing deteriorating conditions in Latin America.
And yet, they're still coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and they're passing through those three countries and Mexico to get to that border. So you have this entire now region essentially, literally in flux. People trying to get out of Cuba, often going to Panama first, right, or Costa Rica, either going north through to Mexico and the United States or somehow getting to Canada or down to Colombia. You have people leaving South America, making their whole way. And this is the thing. He says, well, it's different. You know, the challenge I'm facing is different. And yet there's been no action, right? He's here at the UN this week, for example. Could he not say to the Cuban, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelan officials who are here, hey, why are you letting this happen? Why not carve out some time to say to the Guatemalans, the Salvadorans, the Mexicans again, why do people still feel compelled to leave your country? And how do you tackle this domestic political issue, which is what the Florida and Texas governors are trying to do, when in reality this is a hemispheric-wide regional challenge, right? You can't solve this by November. It takes more than Democrats and Republicans. It takes multiple presidents in different countries.
So your point is there is some space between needing to do something with Congress, which has not been a willing partner, at least Republicans have not been a willing partner with both Republican and Democratic presidents in the past, but there's something between doing nothing with Congress and doing nothing at all.
Right. And you know, they just he has focused on so many other urgent issues, and they are urgent, but here again it comes. And they have tried to put this off for so long, and at this point now they're trying to avoid the conversation going into November. And we'll see what happens, especially if we end up in a divided government in next year, where you're going to have Republicans who support what Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott are doing, and a president who doesn't.
Right. Camilo, let me end by asking you, what's happening with this lawsuit about taking the migrants to Martha's Vineyard?
So a group of Venezuelan migrants who were flown to Martha's Vineyard last week have now filed a lawsuit in federal court in Massachusetts, alleging that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and Florida officials violated several federal laws and the U.S. Constitution when they conducted this transportation operation. These migrants allege in this lawsuit that they were offered McDonald's gift cards, that they were offered free hotel rooms, and that they were told that they were going to Washington, D.C. or Boston, not Martha's Vineyard. They were informed midway during the flight that they were going to Martha's Vineyard, according to this lawsuit. And when they got there, they tried to reach out to the people that offered them the transportation, but they did not receive a response. One mother from Venezuela who brought her 11-year-old child with her to the U.S. Mexico border says she felt distraught, defrauded when she got to Martha's Vineyard, and now they're asking additionally for monetary compensation because of what happened.
And there's also a criminal investigation in Texas.
Correct. We have a sheriff in Texas now investigating whether these migrants were lured into these flights, because it is in his jurisdiction where this shelter is located, where these migrants were being housed before the people who were allegedly contracted by Florida found them.
Last word quickly.
To be clear, this is exactly what Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis want. They want these investigated because now they can turn around and say, why are they worried about that? Why aren't they closing the border?
Yep. Ed O'Keefe, Camilo, thank you so much for being with me.